March 6, 1945. Cologne, Germany. The great Gothic cathedral still stands above a city that has been bombed into gravel, its twin spires black against a gray sky. In the square below, a German Panther tank sits in ambush. Minutes ago it fired on an American Sherman rolling up the boulevard and killed it with a single shot. 3 of the 5 men inside never got out. The Panther's commander now waits for the next American to make the same mistake. For most of the war, that was a bet the Germans could count on winning. American tank against German tank at close range in a city street. The odds favored the heavier gun and the thicker armor, and both belonged to the Panther. But the tank now creeping toward that square through a side street was not another Sherman. It was something the United States Army had spent 5 years refusing to build, and it had arrived in Germany only weeks before. In under a minute, one American tank was about to settle an argument that had cost thousands of lives. This is how it got there. To understand the machine in that side street, you have to understand the problem it was built to solve. The tank that won the war for the American Army was the M4 Sherman. It was reliable, easy to build, easy to repair, and there were tens of thousands of them. What it was not, by 1944, was a match for the best German armor. The Sherman's short 75mm gun could not punch through the sloped front plate of a Panther at normal combat range. The Panther could destroy a Sherman from well beyond the range at which the Sherman could hurt it. Crews knew this. They gave their tanks bitter nicknames and welded spare track and sandbags onto the hulls, hoping to buy a few more millimeters of protection. The Army did try to close the gap. A version of the Sherman with a longer 76mm gun reached the front in 1944, and it was a real improvement. Against the sloped front plate of a Panther at fighting range, it was still not enough, unless the crew had rare tungsten cord ammunition or a clean shot at thinner side armor. And the Sherman had earned a grim reputation of its own. Early models burned so readily when hit that crews on both sides had nicknames for the sight of one going up. Better ammunition storage reduced the danger in later models, but the fear of the flames never entirely left the men who rode inside. The tank they feared most was the Panther. Germany had rushed it into service at the Battle of Kursk in 1943 as an answer to the Soviet T-34, and within a year it had become the yardstick the Allies measured themselves against. Its long 75mm gun threw a shell on a flat, fast path that could reach out and kill at distances where a Sherman's rounds simply bounced off. Its front plate, 80mm of steel laid back at a steep angle, turned aside most of what the Americans could send at it. A well-handled Panther in a good position was, for a Sherman crew, close to a death sentence. The strange part is that the American Army had known how to fix this for years and chose not to. The men who ran Army ground forces, led by Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, believed that tanks should not fight other tanks. In their doctrine, tanks were meant to break through and race into the enemy's rear, while specialized tank destroyers, lightly armored and fast, handled enemy armor. On paper, it was tidy. In the hedgerows of Normandy and the forests of the German border, it fell apart. The enemy tanks were there whether the doctrine liked it or not, and the Shermans had to fight them. A heavy tank with a big gun had been on the drawing board since 1942. Again and again, the request to build it in numbers was delayed, watered down, or shelved. The soldiers who paid for those delays paid in burning tanks. By late 1944, with the cost impossible to ignore, the program finally moved. The result was the T-26E3, standardized in March 1945 as the M26 Pershing, named for the general who had led the American Expeditionary Force in the First World War. It weighed about 46 tons, roughly 10 tons more than a Sherman, and almost every one of those tons went where it mattered. The front of the hull carried 102 millimeters of armor, the mantlet around the gun close to 114. This was a tank that could take a hit from the front and keep fighting, something the Sherman crews could only dream about. The heart of it was the gun. The Pershing carried a 90mm M3, a weapon adapted from a proven anti-aircraft design. Firing standard armor-piercing shot, it left the muzzle at 2,650 feet per second, enough to trade blows with a Tiger on even terms. When the crew had the scarce tungsten-cored high-velocity rounds, muzzle velocity climbed to 3,350 feet per second, and the gun could threaten the heaviest armor Germany fielded. For the first time in the war, an American tank crew could look at a Panther across a street and know that their first shot had a real chance of ending the fight. Underneath, the Pershing broke with American habit in another way. Instead of the older spring systems, it rode on torsion bars, steel rods that twisted to absorb the shock of rough ground. It gave the tank a steadier ride and a steadier gun. A 500-horsepower Ford engine pushed all 46 tons to about 30 miles an hour on a road. It was slower than a Sherman and thirstier, and its transmission was working near its limit under all that weight. Nobody who built it pretended it was perfect. What it was finally was a fair fight. Getting even a handful of them to the front became its own small campaign. In February 1945, Major General Gladion Barnes led a special team to Europe, the Zebra mission, to put new weapons into the hands of frontline troops and see how they held up in combat rather than on a proving ground. The first shipment was tiny. 20 of these new tanks arrived at the Belgian port of Antwerp, and the First Army split them between two of its armored divisions, the 3rd and the 9th. After years of argument, the American answer to the Panther reached the war 20 tanks at a time. They went into action almost at once. On the 25th of February, near the Roer River, the 3rd Armored Division took its Pershings into combat for the first time. A day later, at the town of Elsdorf, the war taught the crews that a better tank does not make a man invincible. A Pershing named Fireball sat watching a roadblock, its shape lit up against a burning building behind it. A Tiger, hidden and patient, put 3 rounds into it from about 100 yards. The first shell went through the mantlet and killed the gunner and the loader. The lesson was brutal and immediate. Position and surprise still decided everything. But the same fighting also showed the other side of the coin. Not far away, Sergeant Nick Mashlonick put his Pershing's 90mm gun to work and knocked out a dug-in Tiger with 4 rounds of the high-velocity ammunition. The tool worked. The men just had to learn to use it. There was one more Pershing in Europe worth knowing about. A single experimental version, later nicknamed the Super Pershing, carried a much longer 90mm gun that could outshoot almost anything the Germans had left on the battlefield. Its crew, serving with the 3rd Armored Division, did not trust the factory armor to keep them alive. They cut steel plate from a wrecked German tank and welded it onto the front of their own, giving the machine a patched, homemade look that no engineer had ever drawn. In April 1945, it destroyed a German tank in a brief, violent exchange, a glimpse of what the design could do when pushed to its limit. Only that single Super Pershing ever reached the war. Which brings the story back to Cologne. By early March, the 3rd Armored Division, nicknamed the Spearhead, was fighting its way into the city, the 4th largest in Germany and a symbol the Nazi regime badly wanted to hold. The fighting was house to house, street to street, through rubble that had once been neighborhoods. Rising over all of it, almost untouched, stood the cathedral. It had been struck by more than a dozen bombs during the war, yet its 2 towers still held while nearly everything around them had been beaten flat. And in the open square at its foot sat the Panther, having just killed that Sherman and its crew. The tank sent to deal with it was the Pershing named Eagle 7. Its commander was Staff Sergeant Bob Early. The gunner, 21 years old, was Corporal Clarence Smoyer, a quiet young man from a coal town in Pennsylvania who had turned out to be one of the finest tank gunners in the division. With them were the loader, John DeRiggy, the driver, William McVeigh, and the bow gunner, Homer Davis. Early made the call that would decide the fight. Rather than nose straight into the square where the Panther's gun was already trained down the obvious approach, They would come at it from the side, out of a narrow street, and catch it from an angle it was not watching. It very nearly went wrong anyway. As Eagle 7 edged into view, the German commander, Lieutenant Wilhelm Bartelborth, saw a tank and hesitated. By one account, he took the Pershing for a German vehicle and told his gunner to hold fire. Those few seconds were everything. Inside Eagle 7, Clarence Smoyer did not wait for the tank to stop and settle. He fired on the move, sending the first 90mm round into the Panther. Then, as the driver braked, he put in 2 more. All 3 shells struck home, one under the gun shield, the others into the side of the hull. The Panther shuddered and began to burn. Every second of it was recorded. A Signal Corps cameraman named Jim Bates had positioned himself at a window overlooking the square, and his camera was rolling as the shells hit and the smoke rose. That film is the reason this one skirmish, among thousands like it, is remembered at all. It ran in newsreels across the United States and around the world. For the folks back home, this was not a diagram or a claim in a press release. It was their tank on screen, beating the German tank that had terrorized their sons. Inside the burning Panther, 4 of the 5 German crewmen forced their hatches open and scrambled clear. One did not make it out, and the square claimed another life that the newsreels rarely mentioned. A German woman named Katharina Esser, trying to drive clear of the fighting, was caught in the crossfire and mortally wounded. Bates filmed her too, a civilian dying in the ruins of her own city, a reminder that behind the famous duel was a real street full of real people. Cologne fell within a day. The very next morning, further south, other men of the First Army rushed a railway bridge that still stood across the Rhine at Remagen and seized it before the Germans could bring it down. The last great barrier into Germany had been broken. The war in the West now had weeks left to run instead of years. The hard truth is that the Pershing arrived too late to change the outcome of the war. Only about 20 of them saw combat before Germany surrendered, out of a few hundred shipped and a couple thousand built. Germany was already collapsing. If the tank had reached the front a year earlier, in the summer of 1944, it might have saved a great many Sherman crews. It did not, and no amount of engineering could give those men their time back. But the Pershing's real legacy was not the battles it fought in 1945. It was the tanks that came after it. The M26 was rebuilt and improved into the M46 pattern, and its layout, a heavy, well-armed tank meant to fight other tanks head-on, became the template for the American main battle tank for a generation. The doctrine that had held it back died with the war. Every American tank that followed carried a little of the lesson learned in that cathedral square. The people carried it too. Decades later, in 2013, Clarence Smoyer went back to Cologne. Waiting for him was Gustav Schaefer, one of the men who had crewed the Panther he destroyed. 2 old soldiers who had once tried to kill each other stood together on the cathedral steps, and later sat with a beer between them and talked. They visited the grave of Katharina Esser and laid flowers. In 2019, the surviving members of the Eagle 7 crew were finally awarded the Bronze Star for what they did that day. By then, Clarence Smoyer was the only one still alive to receive it. The tank the American Army spent 5 years refusing to build reached the war with only weeks to spare. It changed almost nothing about how the Second World War ended. But for 6 seconds in a ruined square, under the towers of a cathedral that somehow still stood, it proved that the argument had always had an answer. The men who fought in Shermans had been right all along. They just never got to use it in time.